Welcome back, everyone. In this video, I'll give you a step-by-step guide to replacing the front rotors and brake pads on a 4th generation Honda Odyssey. In my case, I'm replacing the factory brakes that came with the van when I purchased it new about 40,000 miles ago with centric rotors and ceramic Akebono pads that are among the most recommended on the Audi Club forum by other Odyssey owners. Let's get started. Set the parking brake and chock the rear wheels to prevent accidental movement. While the tires are still on the ground and resistance is present, crack the lug nuts. Raise the van off of the ground and put the front end on jack stands. Replace the jack again with light pressure to ensure a safety backup, and then do a bump test on the van. Remove the front wheels. Slide the wheel under the van alongside the jack stand as an extra precaution in case the jack stands fail. Turn the steering wheel towards the side of the van you're working on for easier access to the caliper. Remove the brake hose mounting bolt. This bolt requires a 12mm socket. Remove the caliper flange bolts. These two bolts require a 14mm socket. Do this by using an adjustable wrench or a 19mm wrench to hold down the flange nut while loosening the bolts. Remove the bolt on the bottom of the caliper first so that the top bolt prevents the caliper from opening up and flipping down on you as you loosen the bottom bolt. Pull the caliper off and place it on the top of an overturned 5-gallon bucket. You could also hook it to the strut using a bungee cord, hanger, or zip tie. Pull out the old brake pads, springs, and shims and discard them. Remove the caliper bracket mounting bolts. These two bolts require a 19mm socket. You may need a breaker bar or an impact driver to remove these as they are quite tight. If you're in a pinch and don't have a breaker bar, slide off the top of your floor jack handle and use it instead. Remove the caliper bracket from the knuckle and set it aside for now. Remove the rotor factory screw. In the best case scenario, it can be removed with a regular screwdriver, but you may need an impact driver to get it out. In the worst case scenario, you may need to drill it out. If you need to drill it out, use a 9mm or 11/32 drill bit and drill until you meet resistance from the rotor itself. Remove the old rotor. In the best case scenario, it will slide right off as soon as you remove the rotor screw like mine did. If it does not, bang on the rotor a few times with a rubber mallet to loosen it from the hub. If this doesn't work, you can try using two 8mm extractor bolts to push the rotor away from the hub using the holes provided in the rotor. Clear the hub surface of rust using a steel brush, including the hub ring. Clean the hub surface with brake cleaner. Apply a small amount of anti-seize all around the hub and the hub ring sticking out to make sure that it's easier to remove the rotor in the future. You can find links to all the tools and lubricants I used in the description below. Place the new rotor on and use a lug nut to hold the rotor in place. An optional step is to apply anti-seize to the new rotor screw and screw it into the rotor. I like to put these on so that the caliper bracket doesn't accidentally scrape against the rotor during reassembly. However, these screws are not required and do not serve a functional purpose once the wheels are installed with lug nuts torqued. The lug nut clamping force holds the rotors on, not these little screws. Clean both the front and back sides of the new rotor with brake cleaner to remove the grease the manufacturer put on them to prevent rust buildup. Once you've completed this step, your new rotor is ready to have the brake pads and caliper attached. Pop out the retainer clips from the caliper bracket using a screwdriver and throw them away. Do not be tempted to reuse your old brake hardware such as the clips or springs. Doing so can wear out your new brake pads prematurely. Besides, a new hardware kit for this van costs less than $10, so there's no good reason not to order a kit when you buy your new pads and rotors. Scrub the caliper bracket where the pad clip retainers and brake pads sit with a wire brush. You could also use a wire wheel or a flat file depending on the condition of your bracket. Some people even sandblast the entire bracket, so if that suits you, go for it. Mine were in good condition, so I just wire brushed them. Clean the bracket with brake cleaner. Remove the guide pins and clean them well. Guide pins are responsible for guiding the proper angle for how the brake pad meets the rotor. Some people use acetone, alcohol, or even fine sandpaper to clean them. But again, mine were in good shape, so I just wiped them down with some acetone. Replace the caliper slide pin boots. They come in the hardware kit, and it's really easy, so you might as well do this. Brush on a medium amount of silicone paste onto the guide pin. You must use silicone lubricant and not a petroleum-based lubricant, as the lubricant here so that the rubber surrounding the pins isn't degraded. 3M silicone paste is the gold standard for this job. When applying the paste, don't go too heavy and avoid putting it on the end of the pin. You will notice that only one pin on each front brake bracket contains a rubber bushing at the end. If you don't use the right kind of lubricant, this piece of rubber can swell up and prevent the pin from moving freely, which can lead to uneven brake wear. So, use silicone so this doesn't happen, or replace the bushing if the pin doesn't move freely when you try to put it back in. Apply lubricant to the pad mounts where the abutment clips go into the caliper bracket. There is considerable debate on what kind of lubricant should be used here. Since brakes are the hottest components on the van, I chose to use a boundary layer lubricant that could handle high temperatures and cannot be easily washed away or attract dirt. Grease can really only handle temps up to about 400 degrees, so I don't use it. The type of lubricants I favor have a high solid, friction-reducing content and include moly, graphite, or copper. I chose the copper lubricant found in anti-seize. Replace the cleaned caliper bracket. Apply thread locker to the bracket bolts to prevent them from backing out due to vibration while you drive. Do not use anti-seize on them. If you do want to use anti-seize, make sure that you reduce the torque you apply to the bolts during tightening. Use a torque wrench to tighten the bolts. The caliper bracket is now finished, so let's work on the caliper. Open the brake fluid dispenser cap under the hood so that you're not fighting against brake pressure when you compress the pistons. When you look at the pistons, you'll see that they have adjusted themselves to match your worn-out pads, so you'll need to reset the piston to its original position before the caliper, along with your new and thicker brake pads, will fit over the rotor. Before we compress the pistons, spray brake cleaner on a paper towel and wipe away the dust and debris on the exposed pistons in the caliper. Compress the pistons by putting one of the old brake pads over them and tightening down each one with a brake pad spreader. You will need to alternate sides until each piston is fully compressed, meaning you can no longer turn the spreader against your old brake pad. Clean the opposite side of the caliper with a stiff metal brush. You can also use a flat file to do this. Spray this end of the caliper with brake cleaner to clean it off. Put anti-seize on the part of the caliper where the caliper meets the back of the brake pad. Your caliper is now ready. Before you forget, replace the brake fluid dispenser cap under the hood. Clean both sides of the new brake pads with brake cleaner. Put a small amount of anti-seize on the back of the pads on the shims. This is another metal-to-metal contact point. Speaking of shims, you may have noticed that the OEM pads came with two shims on the inside pad. I chose not to replace the outer shim and just stuck with the shims my new pads came with. You'll find different opinions on what to do with your extra shim, so research it further if you wish. Put anti-seize on the ears of the pads where they rub against the holder. This is a high metal-to-metal contact point, so don't skimp on the lubricant here. Replace the pads back into the holder. If the pads do not fit easily, file them down so that they do. Now it's time to install the brake return springs. These springs apply tension on the pads to keep them off the surface of the brake rotor when you are not applying the brakes. You can try to just stick them in and see what happens, but you'll likely have something like this happen to you. If you don't have a helper, the easiest way I found to install them is to reinstall the caliper with the top bolt only and keep the bolts somewhat loose. Cover the tops of the pads slightly with the caliper. Then, clamp the pads together at the bottom. Place in the springs, and then as you slowly lower the caliper over the pads, the caliper will take over holding the pads in place so that you can remove the clamp. Be careful to watch both sides of the pads as you lower the caliper in place so that the caliper doesn't pull off a shim. Now you can tighten both of the caliper flange bolts. Make sure you have both bolts in place before you tighten them. When you tighten these sets of bolts, tighten the inside nuts down with a wrench as well. Reinstall the brake hose mounting bolt. Make sure that you've not twisted the brake hose while you were working on it like I did here, or you'll have to remove the caliper and twist it back before installing this bolt. Clean the rotor one more time with brake cleaner in case you got anything on it. After this is done, replace the wheels with the lug nuts, lower the van to the floor, and tighten the lug nuts. Pump the brakes 4 to 5 times. Use very small strokes on the brake pedal. Don't push it all the way to the floor. A last but optional step is to bed the pads. My Akebono pads don't require this step, but I chose to do it anyway. I've put instructions for how to bed the pads in the description below. This completes your brake replacement job. Thanks for watching.